If I could go back in time and meet myself as a younger developer, I think the one tip I would give myself is to properly learn the Chrome DevTools, also known as the Chrome Inspector, because that allows you to play around with the HTML, the CSS and the JavaScript, and to properly understand how the browser works, and you're able to figure out on your own what's wrong with your code instead of having to search online over and over again. And you don't have to do this trial and error to just try different variations of your code and just see what works. You can actually go into the HTML, CSS and JavaScript and actually see what the browser is doing with it. And it's such a nice playground to play around before you write the code, and you will write a lot less errors. So let's fire up a simple website and get into the DevTools, and I will show you all the features that I use the most, and it should give you a really nice base to figure out your problems on your own. So let's get into it. So I created a very basic website here. This is the document. It links to a style sheet, and here we have the body, and here we can see we have one inline style, which is to set the background to black. We have one H1, one header that just has a computer emoji, and then we're also linking a JavaScript file. So let's begin with this CSS file and see what that one has. It sets a background to the body to hot pink, and remember in the HTML we also had an inline style that sets the background to black. So these ones are a little bit in a conflict now, but we're going to use the Chrome DevTools to figure out what actually is going to happen with the background of the body. The text color is white, the height of the body is the entire viewport height, 100% of the viewport height, no margin, and we set the content of the body to be flexed and to be in the center horizontally. And when the body is hovered, we want to change our background to sea green instead of hot pink. And for the H1 we set the font size to 24. In our JavaScript, it's just 4 lines of code. We have an array of messages, the first element being hello and the second one being world. And then we start to loop through these messages and we just console log them. So now we are ready to go into the Chrome DevTools. So here we have our site, and to open up the DevTools, we right click and we click inspect. We can also use Ctrl+Shift+I, and that brings up this view, and this is the Chrome DevTools or the Chrome Inspector, whatever you want to call it. So let's start here in the top left. If I press this one, this allows me to select an element in the document. So if I start hovering here, if I hover the computer here, we see that this is the H1. So when I click on the element, you see that it gets selected in the view to the left here. Also, if I am hovering inside the inspector here, you can see that they highlight and show where they are inside the actual page. So that's also very useful. If I and this is the Elements tab, the first tab that we're in right now. In this tutorial, we're going to look at the Elements tab, the Console tab, the Sources tab, which is for the JavaScript, the Network tab, and we're also going to take a quick peek in the Application tab. So this is the main view, and we also have a view down here called the Drawer. And here we also can add some tabs, and you can see all the tabs that are available if you click these 3 buttons. But now let's move on to the Elements tab. So the Elements tab is split in 2. The top part shows our document, and you can open and close these different tags. So we open up the body and we see the contents of the body. And once we select an element, we get some information about that element. So this part here shows that we're inside HTML, body, and then H1. So what we're seeing down here is the styling for H1. So I'm on the styles tab of this down section. So if I look at the styles, I see what styles are being applied to this element. So we can see that the styling that we saw in our CSS file, the font size, is being applied here. And I can toggle this off and on using this checkbox here. So if I deselect this style, it gets dashed out, and we can see that the size of our computer emoji is actually changing. And when we deselect this style, we see that something changes here in the default styles that the browser has. If I re-enable it, we see that the default style gets dashed out here, gets disabled. So this is a very nice way to toggle your styles and see, like, are they making a difference in this this view here. We can also go into the computed styles. So you can think of the computed styles as the result of all these rules here. So if I go into the computed styles for the H1, we can see that we have a font size here, and if we right now it says 32. It's 2M from the user agent style sheet, so you can think of that as the browser's default style. So if I re-enable our styling for the H1, if we go into computed, we can see in a more concise list here that the browser default styling is disabled because we're setting our own font size here. And you can see here that it comes from styles.css and line 12. So it's easy for us to track down where this is coming from. Inside the computed view, we also have a very useful little visualization of the element and how it relates to the padding, the border, and the margin. So if we hover this, we see that this is the size of our actual element. If we were to have padding around it, we would see the values of that inside this box. And then comes the border, and same here. And then you see outside the border, that's like the end of the actual element, and the margin is actually placed outside our element as a spacer. So this is very good to understand how the browser styling works when it comes to padding, border, and margin, to get a nice overview. So now let's focus a little bit on the body, because remember that I had put this background black as an inline style, but inside our style sheet we had some other values for the background, and we actually had two, one for just a normal state and another one for our hover state. So we don't want to have to hover this body. Maybe we want it to always be in a hovered state. Then we can use this toggle element state selector here. We get a little menu that opened up, and we can click the hover state. So now the body is in a hover state. We get this yellow icon to show that we modified the element state. So now a new style appeared here, that the body : hover should have background sea green. But both of these are disabled now because we have an inline style which has a higher priority. So to see this in action, we need to disable the inline style. And now we see that the body hover styling is now prioritized. And if I were to disable the hover state, we instead fall back on the hot pink. So now I can actually manually hover it and see the change just by putting the mouse on top of the body here. So that is one way to debug why some of your styles are not working. We can go to the computed for this one and see that black has priority because it's an element.style, indicating that it's an inline style directly on the element, and the hot pink coming from the style sheet is disabled. So that is a good base for how to debug styles in the browser. Now let's move to the console tab. As you can see here, we get two console outputs, and let's look at where they come from. It's actually line 3 here in our main.js, and we can see that it says main.js:3, indicating line 3. If we want to stop inside line 3, there's a keyword for that called debugger. So now when I saved the file, the page reloaded, and once it came to the debugger line, it stopped. So now we don't yet have anything printed to the console, but if I press play, it will run line 4 and then go into the second iteration of the loop. So let's do that. The play button is down here, resume script execution. So now it ran line 4 once, giving us the first message of this message list. And if I want to stop here without having to type the debugger, I can press the line number here. So this gives us a breakpoint. So now let's try to remove this debugger and instead stop here by this breakpoint. So now it continued and moved one line and it stopped at line 4. So now let's continue and then reload the page. So now I don't have the debugger statement anymore, but I got it to stop at line 3 here. If I stop inside the code, that means that I am now in this context of this code execution. So I can hover these variables. I can see that the message that we're on right now in the loop is hello. And I can hover the messages variable and see what the variable looks like. And because I'm stopping right here now, I get access to all the variables inside the console. So if I type message here, I can get access to this, and this is also very useful. If I plan to write some more code here and do some more things with message, I can try them out here. Message.to lowercase, for example. I can try out my code before I write it to make sure I write it correctly. So this is also very useful. If I want to keep playing the code like straight up, I can just press the play button. But if I want to step line by line, I can do it with this step over button here. And to remove a breakpoint, you just press the line again. And here we have some useful information about the scope. So here we can see that in our block scope, meaning this for loop, our message variable is world now, because now we're on the second iteration of the loop. And inside the script scope, which is the scope up here, we can see the variables available to us here. There's also a global scope, which is the window scope, where we have all the browser functions available to us. We can also set up a watch for a variable. So here we can set some specific things to look for. We can also set up custom breakpoints. So if we edit this breakpoint, we can say that for us to stop, message needs to be equal to hello. So now let's reload the page. So we see that it stopped here because message is hello, but the second time we run, message should be world, so it should not stop again now. So the second time it did not stop because this breakpoint was just for when the message was hello. So this is also very useful to stop in the code just when a certain condition is met. Now let's move over to the network tab. So Here we can see what was downloaded from the server to our browser. So we see that the first thing that was downloaded was this index.html. And we see the status code 200, which means OK. We see the type. We see the size of it. And we can also see the time it took to download it. If we look at here, we can see that the initiator of downloading the style.css file was the index.html. Same for the main.js. We also have a WebSocket here, and this one is actually just used from the live server to know when the file system changed, so that the browser knows that it needs to reload because there are changes to the files that it is running. So this is not something that we built, this is something added by the live server that we're using. So here inside the headers tab of this request of the document, you can see all the headers. Here is some general information about the requests. Here are the response headers, and we also have the request headers. Here we see a preview of the actual document that was downloaded. We can do the same for the CSS and same for the JS. So this network tab can be really useful. You can also filter on different content types. So if I'm looking for the CSS files, I can filter like this, or just JavaScript files, or just a document. We can also search for stuff. So if I type style here, I just get files matching to style. This disable cache can be really good to do if you want to make sure that it always fetches the files from the server and is not using client caching. Here's another useful feature. If you want to see what your site will feel like on a slow 3G network, you can set this preset here and then reload the page, and now we can see that things are taking a lot more time to download. So then we get these green bars that indicates the timings. So this first green bar would be the document, and then we can see that the styling and the JavaScript is actually being fetched simultaneously here. So this graph here gets a good understanding of the network traffic that is going on when your site is being downloaded. Let's move forward to the application tab. So here we have some cool stuff. I was going to focus mostly on this storage area here. So here we can actually see the local storage of our site. So sometimes you store some data that should persist across page reloads. So you can see the keys and the values here. Here we can have the session storage that is going to live on for as long as you keep your tab open. So it's not as persistent as local storage. The view here looks very similar between local storage and session storage since they work very similarly. In the session storage, we can actually see that live server is using this to store some data. Is this first time log from live server, and the value is true. We also have index.db, and we also have the cookies. So the cookies also look quite similar to local storage, but it has some more parameters that you can look here and that you can see here. Now we've looked through the tabs up here that I use the most. We did not yet talk about this button, but this is to switch the view between a desktop view and a mobile device view. So here we can see that we can choose what device we want to try it out on. We can set custom dimensions, we can set the zoom level, and so on. Now let's leave the top view here and open something called the drawer. And it's called the drawer because it's in the bottom here. So we can see that we have one console living in the drawer and another console living as a tab up here. And the console we already tried out a bit, so let's look at a few other tabs. So we will open up, for example, the search tab, and this can be very useful to find specific pieces of your code. Let's say that I want to figure out something about the background. If I search for background, I can see results both in my styling and inside the document. Or let's say that I'm looking for where the code about the messages are. Here we can see that I get results from the JavaScript file, and once I click them, the top part is navigating to that specific part. So that is also very useful, and I use that one a lot. Here is another cool feature called rendering. So if you're using a framework like React, once you have data changes, the site will re-render. You can use paint flashing to see things in your document that are changing. So now I enabled paint flashing here. We can also get some stats about the FPS, frames per second, to debug performance issues. And you have a bunch of options to look through here. But now that we have paint flashing, let's go back to the Elements tab. So let's say that I want to make some changes to my document, but I want to do them only here in the inspector. So I will select my H1 and I will copy it. Then I will click the background and I want to copy another H1 into the body. So now I press Ctrl V, and you did see a little paint flash on these H1s because the document was modified. So I can use like copy paste in here. I can also double click, for example, this laptop and change it to something else, and it will instantly reflect in the DOM. So this is very useful for trying out things. You can right click here and do edit as HTML. So now we get an editor window here. I can do style, and I can change the color to be hot pink. So now that I close this editor window, I see that this style was actually added and the DOM changed. We also saw a paint flash on this one since it changed. And now when I go to the style inspector here, we can see that we do in fact have an inline style that we can see here, and we can toggle that one on and off, and we see the paint flashing on it. So of course, once I reload the page now, all that my changes that I made inside the inspector will be gone. So for example, this extra H1, once I reload, it's gone. But it's very good to play around in the inspector before you write the actual code, because you will write fewer errors that way. So I hope that this gave you a really good base for how to track down bugs in your application, and it's such a good way to learn web development, to play around here, because it's much faster than just doing trial and error coding and just writing stuff that don't work and then trying to figure out why. It's much better to dig around in here and change stuff, and it will give you a really good understanding about how to do things when it comes to web development. So I hope you learned something from this. If you liked the video, please thumbs up the video, consider being a subscriber, and you can ask questions in the comments. Have a good day.